in the St. Louis area, and he's the author of one of my favorite volumes. It's called All Work and No Pay, that came out, I'm thinking, if I remember right, in about 1983, published by Spencer Judd here in Tennessee, as part of a very exciting development in the world of marketing the Constitution, and that is by Tupper Saucier, a very noted writer and a monetary activist in his own right. Dr. Hind's book, All Work and No Pay, again, I guess 1983, and it is by at the hand of a man who was the chief writer of the Monetary Realist Society, which called for a return of lawful coin and currency, Constitution respecting currency, of course, which is currency is the issue of the coin, right? The coin is held on reserve, and the currency, the banknotes, issue from the holder of the coins, right? The coin are the thing of value, and the currency is the manageable, light, portable representation of the money, the coin held by the person who wrote the note. So the note says, here, you can have this piece of paper that lets you claim the money, or you can have the money itself, which is kind of heavy. Dr. Hind, why do people shy away from cash today? People use credit for everything, and cash is suspect. Cash is dangerous. It's risky to hold cash. Why is that? Why do we have this sort of naive belief that it's dangerous to have cash on your person?
Oh, good question, Mr. Tulis. I'm not sure most people have given it any thought. They just accept it because it's easier. Cash can be stolen, and that would be bad. A credit card can be stolen, but you can call a credit card company and tell them to stop payment, and that'll take care of it. So I think people have just become, I guess you might say, brainwashed to think that having cash is old-fashioned and inefficient. Although I have to laugh when I go to the store to buy something. I give my credit card, and there's all sorts of clicking and fooling around with computers. And if you have the new credit cards with the little electronic thing on them that you slide in, it takes a long time for that to work. And how much simpler it was with cash. You know, you just handed them a bill, and they gave you the goods. But the computer and the computerized banking system that's supposed to, I guess, to make things simpler and faster, seems to make it more complicated and more tedious.
Well, a man with $400 or $500 on him in cash is an unusual sight. I remember once I was dealing with the church elders on our church went to became we dropped our corporate status, and we were at the title office on the last steps. This was January 20, and there was some question about writing a check to the title company to pay for that transaction. And I said, well, I've got a few $100s on me. Let me just see if I can cover that, and you can just reimburse me. And there was just shock among the elders that he was a person who had a few $100s on him just as a matter of routine. And somehow that's dangerous. You could be David, you could be mugged, you could be assaulted. But crime is really at an all-time low, and it's very unlikely that a man's going to be knocked over and his billfold taken. And yet we think that if we have cash, somehow we're immediately vulnerable. It makes us likely to be beaten and robbed.
Cash is bad from the banking system's point of view because when you think about it, it's the only way that you can own money. If you deposit that $100 bill in the bank, or if you deposit a check in the bank, it becomes the property of the bank. No one has any money in the bank, although we say that, oh, I've got $1,000 in the bank. No, you don't. Anything you put in the bank becomes the title to property of the bank. I don't think that's in controversy. That's an accepted fact. All you have from the bank is an account, a listing of numbers of what you put in and what they have to give you back. If you were foolish enough, and I'm sure none of your listeners are, to deposit, say, 10 silver dollars in the bank worth, say, $300, and you went to get it back, they'd give you a check for $10 or a $10 bill, and you'd have substantial loss about which I don't think you could do anything because the money you put in the bank belongs to the bank, and you put in $10 and they're going to give you back $10. So if you want to have money and own it yourself and not have it subject to somebody else, because after all, if you don't own your property, you're at the mercy of somebody who does, then of course cash is the way to go. And then it enables you to deal privately with other people, of course, which again is anathema to the banking system.
Is the banking system part of national government's surveillance of the American people, such as my listener, Dr. Hind?
The banking system owns the federal government, I think, although, of course, I can't prove that, and it may technically not be true, but the late Merrill Jenkins, who founded monetary realism, was fond of saying, "Who pays the piper calls the tune." And the bankers pay the piper. I mean, the government couldn't exist and couldn't finance all these wars without the government, without the bankers churning out the money to do it. And yeah, I think the bankers own the government and dictate policy through their stooges, the people that we elect naively to represent us.
Well, how can the bankers be so powerful, Dr. Hahn? In 2008, in the meltdown, I remember the Congress voted to bail out the banking sector to the tune of $800 billion. That was the first, under President Bush, the first bailout of this sector. A sector that creates money from nothing, the only one that can do that, had to be supported by direct taxpayer funding of some of its major players.
Yeah, that's a good question. I used to ponder how an organization which creates money out of thin air, as you said, can go bust. But it's all a question of bookkeeping. I mean, the bank's assets are the liabilities of its depositors. If you borrow $1 million from the bank, your IOU is their asset. If you go belly up, your IOU becomes worthless. And in that case, the bank's assets suffer a great loss. And so if a number of the borrowers are unable to repay, then technically the bank is in trouble, although it's in trouble having lost nothing.
So
really.
The banks,
and in order for it to appear that banks are like other businesses instead of magic businesses that create money, they have to go through this routine of apparently suffering a great loss and then getting bailed out. Although, as you point out, getting bailed out is ridiculous because they can simply print up enough money to bail themselves back in again.
Now, in the banking relationship, my listener should understand the following, Dr. Hahn, and just tell me if I'm right or wrong, that the listener's deposit is the bank's liability, and the listener's promise to pay in a loan, that is the bank's asset. Is that what you said?
Absolutely. I mean, you might think that if you deposit $100 in the bank, oh boy, that's the bank's asset. No, that's the bank's liability because they're liable to pay you back that $100 when you demand it. But if you borrow from the bank, your note promising to pay them back the sum that you borrowed, that's their asset. And they could sell that, for example, and they sometimes do, I think.
So the listener really is the value of the bank. The listener's promised to pay for his car, for his bit of farmland that he bought, for a repair, let's say on an air conditioning unit. That promise to pay is the bank's asset. It's the bank's wealth. The bank's wealth is premised on the listener's good character, the listener's ability to repay.
Yes. But interestingly, I think I mentioned this the last time, but it's a point that I think is very important. What you borrow from the bank isn't money. You borrow the bank's promise to pay, because all of our so-called money, whether it be a check or cash, is in the form of an IOU, so to speak, or a pledge to pay. And you give them, in return for their promise to pay, you give them your promise to repay. That makes everything even, Stephen. And I don't understand where the debt lies, except in the minds of the borrower, who think that since they've obtained something of value from the bank, they have to repay the bank with something of value. And they have to pledge their house or their car, you know, for their failure to do that, which is kind of grotesque when you think what the bank gave them was nothing, simply some numbers that they created out of thin air.
And is it painful for a bank to make these numbers, Dr. Hahn? Does it cost? Do people have to really sweat in the background to say, wow, we're going to make a loan to the listener of Nooga Radio, and man, can we do it? Is there some heavy lifting that goes on with that process, or is there some sweat? Are there some tears? Are there some serious calculations that have to be done that take time and energy of the banking people, Dr. Hahn?
I wouldn't think very much. I mean, the actual creation of money, I guess, used to take pen and ink to put a notation in the borrower's account that he now has this extra number of dollars. But now it's just a few keystrokes of a computer, I'm sure. And as Merrill Jenkins used to point out, that even when it comes to the printing of money, because we used to hear them say, for example, that it costs more to print $1 than it's worth. That's nonsense. I mean, if you can print money, it doesn't cost anything. You can pay for the ink and the paper with the money that you print. So just to print a few more bills, and you've got everything covered.
I was reading this morning, Dr. Hahn, A Bubble That Broke the World, a wonderful book by Garrett. It's a history of, it was published in 1932, it was a history of the post-World War I debt boom and the lending of billions and billions in credit to European governments who needed the money, they say, to pay back war reparations, Germany to pay back war reparations. And there's a discussion about how when you have a credit economy, you build pyramids, and the pyramids are not like that of the pharaoh, whose pyramid was essentially froze the labor of millions of people in a monument that produced no value and couldn't be unbuilt. You couldn't unbuild a monument to restore what had been effectively stolen from his slave populations and given back to them. How is it that that credit economies have monuments? They're not pyramidal monuments in our day, but they have other shapes. How are these monuments? What's in, let's say, a bridge to nowhere, or a new shopping mall in a saturated retail economy? Talk a little bit about how money goes to make these monuments, and then what happens? What happens when the project goes bust?
Well, then I guess they have to come to the taxpayer and get some more money or bail somebody out. The whole idea that you mentioned, the First World War, that was not the beginning, as I've just been reading, but a continuation of the process of continuous government expansion made possible by the creation of money. I think it's interesting, and I've never had anybody speak about it, that when the Federal Reserve Bank was established here in 1913 and began operations in 1914, they brought Paul Warburg over from Germany, head of the German banking family, to be the first chairman of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. His brother Max, I may have the two switched, I'm not sure, his brother Max remained in Germany as head of the German bank. In 1917, when the United States entered the First World War, therefore, it was the Warburg family that was financing both sides of the war. I mean, that was a really clever deal. And war has been the monument, I guess you might say. The fallen bodies of the soldiers have been the monument to the banking system's ability to create money and make it possible for the government that they control to engage in all of these preposterous episodes of spreading out all over the world. The First World War was, I guess, first time that America's attempt was to spread its power throughout the world, or not just limiting it to Cuba or to Hawaii or to some place that they desired to conquer, but every place, the World War.
Garrett describes the idea of the pyramid as something that's non-productive. We would say, in another term, it's a form of malinvestment. In other words, investment hopes to go into building something that does not produce a return, cannot pay off the loan, if you will. And there are, of course, the government is a gigantic consumer of assets and credit, and its monuments are its many, many agencies, its many programs, its doles, its regulatory fiefdoms, and the like. And the idea of malinvestment, Dr. Hine, is that there's no return. There's nothing that comes back to create new value. They're non-productive monuments of people's optimism, people's claim to the moment, and the payment will be made by people in the future.
Well, sure. And what better monument could you have to malinvestment than a battleship that costs tens of millions or billions of dollars and then sinks, or airplanes that are shot down? Or there's a place in Arizona, I think, that's called an airplane graveyard, or some term similar to that. Hundreds and hundreds of airplanes, rows and rows of them, as far as you can see, that each one of them costs hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and they're just sitting there. I mean, that's malinvestment. But for those people who built the planes and who financed them, it was a terrific investment.
You mean the factories and the corporations that got the government contract?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, how would you rate our economic system today, Dr. Hine? Is there a lot of liquidity in the system? Is it highly liquid, very rich, or is it just the opposite?
I think just the opposite. We said that the only way banks can fail, and then it's just a formality. You never hear of a banker going to jail. The only way the banks can fail is if their assets become worthless, and that's happening more and more. I mean, more and more companies are simply unable to meet the growing burden of interest that they have to pay to keep things going. More and more companies are failing. I mean, from time to time, there's a list published of big firms that are going out of business or that are closing down hundreds of stores. I think that that's a very ominous sign. And it could mean a disaster for the banking system and, of course, for those people who hold money. So it's probably a good idea to divest yourself of money as much as you can and invest it in something real.
This is David Tulis. Thanks for giving us a few minutes of your time here on Nooga Radio. We're talking with Dr. Paul Hine, who is the author of one of my favorite books, All Work and No Pay. Look that up. It's All Work and No Pay. And the title of that slim volume is really ribbing people who work for green rectangles for their pay. and work and work and work, and they're given something that's a very temporal provisional value that would be dollars, the modern dollar. So, Dr. Hine, your comments tend to make the listener think in favor of gold and silver as a better kind of money. How is gold, or how are gold and silver a better sort of money than paper money?
They hold their value, for one thing. I think that a dollar of silver or a dollar of gold has the same purchasing power today that it had 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years ago. Whereas, obviously, I read someplace that since the inauguration of the Federal Reserve System in 1914, the value of the dollar, the so-called paper dollar, or the checkbook dollar, has lost about 90% of its value, or more than that. So, what you had, what you could buy with a dollar then takes $10 or $100 today. So if you want something to hold its value, gold and silver is excellent for that.
And as paper money and paper dollars fall into repute, especially if there's a meltdown and a loss of confidence, there'll be an exaggerated favor for gold and silver. So that means that the ratio, you can even call it the profit of people who have shifted out of paper into real money, is going to be an exaggerated gain in the meltdown.
Yes, I think. But buying gold and silver, as you might buy a stock, for example, with the hope of making a profit, is okay. But I think you should really think of the precious metals, for example, as a hedge, as a protection. You're not necessarily going to gain from it, although you may gain in that the silver dollar you bought for $10 may be worth $100, but then it'll take $100 at that time to buy what $10 cost when you bought it. So the idea of buying gold and silver to gain is kind of questionable, but buying it for safety is the premier reason, I think, to buy it.
And I would point out to the listener, we're talking here with Dr. Paul Hine, who's the author of All Work and No Pay, that if you have precious metals in your portfolio, they're not really working. They're just waiting for you. They're really savings. And so having gold and silver coins, say you buy a bag of $1,000 for $11,000. By the way, right now, premiums on gold and silver are almost non-existent. So it's a very good time right now to buy gold and silver from your favorite coin dealer. And I do not recommend numismatics. I recommend for bulk content 90% silver money. But that money, Dr. Hine, that my listener might buy in bag or a tray of silver or gold coins, it's not working in the economy. It's there waiting to hold his value. It doesn't work. It's not producing new wealth by being given to someone in a creative enterprise. It is simply waiting to help him.
Yes.
So
yes, I think so.
That's the disadvantage of having that.
Well, I compared it to somebody asked me this question many years ago at a monetary realist reading, and the best answer that I could come up with off the top of my head was it's like the weights that the pharmacist uses to weigh out the medication. If the doctor orders 10 milligrams of a certain drug, how are you going to know that you're getting 10 milligrams? Because he has a standard weight there that he can use to weigh out the drug so that you get enough to help you and not so much that it kills you. So the weight just sits there. It doesn't do any good. Nobody's getting any benefit from it. But when you need it, it's essential. And I think the gold and silver are similar to that. You aren't going to necessarily use it today. But when there's nothing else that you can use, when people laugh at the idea of taking your Federal Reserve notes or your check, then if you've got a silver dollar, you're the king.
Well, this is David Tulis. And Dr. Hine, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Paul Hine is the author of All Work and No Pay that came out in the 1980s, one of my favorite books. You, my listener, if you have a teenage son or daughter, that would be a great introductory volume for basic economics, and that's called All Work and No Pay. Paul Hine, H-E-I-N, is the author. It's on one of my recommended young reader lists. There are several other volumes. You can find out about those books by going to Nooganomics.com, our chief sponsor. That's Nooganomics.com. Dr. Hine is a columnist. You can look up his work. He's a very fine writer, and we're celebrating today Cash Friday. The goal of Cash Friday is for you, my listeners, to go very innocently and mildly to your lender and draw out this may be hard to swallow, a $100 bill or $250. I know that's big money. It will scare you to have it. You might be robbed. But you, my listeners, should do that to assert your independence and pay cash. Local economy loves cash. It avoids the tapeworm tax. which is the credit card fee of up to 5% on a credit card transaction. David Tulis, read Nooganomics.com and subscribe today.
Nooga Radio, AM 1240, 92.